Oh.
Hello? Yeah.
Hallo, alle willkommen. Wie ihr seht, ich bin nicht Lutz Göllner. Ja. Ich sehe nicht ganz so gut aus wie er und bin auch vielleicht nicht ganz so belesen wie er. Aber trotzdem bin ich da und er ist es nicht, weil er in einem Verkehrsstau feststeckte. Ergo wird er demnächst hier auflaufen. Ich habe gehört, er sucht schon einen Parkplatz und wie ich ihn kenne, wird er in unglaublicher Hektik und Eile hierher kommen. Und deswegen hat er mich gebeten, unseren Ehrengast heute Abend, mit dem wir auch talken wollen, hier schon mal reinzuführen und euch vorzustellen. Ich bitte erstmal um einen absolut herzlichen Willkommensapplaus für Klaus Janson.
Dankeschön.
Ich glaube, euch erwartet ein sehr kurzweiliger Talk und ich kann euch auch versichern, ihr werdet es nicht allzu lange mit mir zu tun haben. Sobald also der Lutz da ist, wird er das hier übernehmen und wird mich dann mir auch sofort zeigen, wo meine Grenzen sind. Aber ihr sollt euch nicht langweilen und weil ja hier das Programm ziemlich straff ist, haben wir gesagt, ich fange einfach auch schon mal so ein bisschen an mit Smalltalk. Das Gesamte hier ist in Englisch angekündigt. Hat jemand gesteigerte Probleme mit Englisch? So obviously everybody knew that we will talk in English and everybody who came here is able to speak or at least understand English. So now it's up to you to talk in English.
Okay, I can do that.
Perfect, thank you very much. I try my very best. So I will be the host for 5 minutes until our real host is coming up. So a little bit small talking from the beginning, just to warm up. How was the flight?
The flight was fine.
Fine. How long?
7 hours. I live in New York, so I leave Kennedy Airport. 7 hours and then 7 hours to Nuremberg, and then 25 minutes to, where am I going?
Here. Just say here.
To here, yes. Erlangen, yes.
Yeah.
So it's a long trip. I just arrived this morning, so I haven't had too much sleep. And I'm afraid of what I'm going to say. So be gentle.
Originally you wanted to come a day earlier, but due to schedule problems you had to skip this plan. So what are you working actually on?
I'm working on Superman with John Romita Jr. and Jeff Johns as the writer. For DC Comics. I think anybody who knows my career knows that I've worked at Marvel for the last 8 or 9 years, and John asked me to do Superman with him. We were at the San Diego convention last year, and John is very funny, but he came up to me and he said, I have to talk to you. I have to talk to you. So we started talking about doing Superman and the possibility of both of us leaving Marvel. So we're doing Superman. We just finished the second one. The first one will be out next week in the States. And John likes to drop 10, 12 pages at a time. And so right before I came to Erlangen, John dropped 12 pages and a cover, so 13 pages. And I needed that one more day just to finish it. I mean, I don't want to be dramatic about it, but I always want to do my best work. and I want to make sure that the pages look good. And this is an important project for both John and myself and Jeff Johns. And so I want to make sure that it's good. So I asked Alex if we could, just change the flight to one day later. And I needed that day.
So you're working on Superman now. Is it special to work on Superman? Is that like, well, it's Superman, okay, but is this for you special to work on Superman?
When I was a kid, which was a long time ago, Superman was the first book that I read. And I don't know if you know, I was born in Germany. I was born in Coburg, which is about 50 miles from here, about 1 hour by car. And so when I came to America, I discovered comic books, and the first books that I read was Superman. And all of the Superman books. I'll tell you a story. When my mom decided to sell the family house, I had boxes and boxes of comic books in the attic upstairs, and I had to go back to Connecticut, where my mom lived, and take the comics out before she sold the house. So I was expecting to find a lot of great, cool comic books like Batman and Detective Comics, or Green Lantern or Flash. And I opened up the boxes, and they were all Lois Lane comics. So I was so embarrassed. But that's what I read when I was a kid. So I read Superman and Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen and the Superman family. So there's a part of me that wants to do every character at least once. So I've done Batman, I've done Daredevil, I've done Thor, I've done Punisher. I've never done Superman. So when John asks to do Superman, number one, I like working with John a lot. Number two, it's a character that neither one of us have done. And it's an important project for both of us. I knew that John was going to bring his best work to this project. And I wanted to be a part of that, even, as an inker. So I wanted to, I always want to do good work. That's the most important thing to me. And I know that John is, doing very, very good work on Superman, and I want to be a part of it. Hello.
Ladies and Gentlemen, begrüßen Sie mit einem herzlichen Applaus meinen Freund Lutz Göllner. Lutz, wir haben
I'm so sorry.
noch nicht viel geredet.
That's okay. We work in comics, we're used to being late.
Yeah. So you didn't miss too much, we just were joking about you, so nothing special. Yeah. So, no, honestly, we just talked a little bit about his recent project with Superman, and so now you can...
Small talk.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
You can talk over it. So.
All right, let's go, Sparky.
I'm terribly sorry. Normally it's a 4-hour ride, but not today. When I first noticed you was in the German music paper Specs. Someone wrote about your Batman work and the work of Frank Miller and Lynn Waller, of course. 3 terribly motivated artists are going on Batman. So, how motivated were you with Batman?
I think Batman is my favorite comic book character. Even when I was a kid, that was the character that I would draw. So anytime I get to do Batman, I'm highly, highly motivated. And I'm hoping that, while I'm at DC doing Superman with John, that I will be able to pencil and ink some Batman. And we're talking about it now, but it's complicated to sometimes get projects going because the editors and the publishers have their own ideas, so they're very invested in their continuity. And I think anybody who's reading Batman now knows that Scott Snyder is doing a terrific job. Scott and I have been talking about doing some Batman. So we will see if that happens. It's too early to tell. I'll know more when I get back to New York.
And back in 1986, how there were a lot of thinking at DC before Dark Knight Returns came out about changing the ways to look at the superheroes. There were plans made by Frank Miller, Steve Gerber, and so on. Were you involved and John Byrne, of course, were you involved in these plans to start the DC universe anew?
I was a little bit. I think I will surprise you to tell you that I was more involved in the John Byrne Superman than the Batman. There was a time when DC was trying to figure out back then, I forget what year it was, but they were trying to reboot Superman. And there were a lot of meetings and a lot of discussions about what they could do with the character and how they can make it contemporary. And I was involved in that. And they eventually, they went with John Byrne and John's ideas. And John was able to do a couple of Superman books. I think Superman Action. What else was he doing? Do you remember?
He drew Action Comics, and I think he wrote Adventures of Superman.
Right.
And some of those smaller things like World of Smallville, World of Metropolis, World of...
Yeah. The thing that I would say, let me say this just to talk while, what's your name?
Lutz.
Lutz, yeah. while Lutz catches his breath. The year 1986 is such an interesting year to look back on because, and I think you know this, Watchmen came out in 86, Dark Knight came out in 86, and Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And most comic book people look at those three projects, those three books, as changing comics, and I would agree with that. So I mention that because what that says to me is that there was something happening in the air. There was something happening with the comic book community. There was something happening with the creative people. And it's not easy to see that when you're in it. You can only see it clearly after it happens. And so, when Frank and I were doing Dark Knight, nobody, including Frank and myself or Dick Giordano, the editor, who, by the way, Dick was extremely involved in Dark Knight Returns. I would almost say it was his idea. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I know that I knew Dick Giordano. He was my teacher. He was my mentor, and I know that he wanted to do something radical and experimental with Batman, and he wanted to do something that was adult. And I think Frank came to him with Dark Knight, and it was, a perfect storm, as they say. But it's hard to see it when you're in it. So I can look back on it now and I could say, yes, there was something happening and there was something interesting happening in comics. But nobody knew at the time that Watchmen was going to be that good or that Dark Knight was going to stay in your consciousness for this long. I think that would be my point. It's not easy to see it when you're in the middle of it.
So you were yeah. That's my question. You were in the middle of this comic revolution, and you didn't notice what's going on.
No, we were just, it's we were all friends. You talk about Steve Gerber. I used to run into Steve Gerber at the office, at the Marvel office, and we would just kid around, and you don't plan these things. You don't sit down at your desk and say, I'm going to be part of a revolution. It doesn't work that way. It comes together naturally or organically. There's no plan. And if you make a plan, I think you're going to fail. It just doesn't work that way.
So normally the big superhero publishers in the USA are very protective about their characters. How did you get away with all this stuff in Dark Knight, this crazy stuff?
I think that people, I would give Dick Giordano a lot of credit. I think people were ready for something different. I think Frank was really pushing the boundaries of story and storytelling. It's a funny thing. Let me give you a inappropriate comparison. If I play the Beatles to a 14-year-old today, he or she is not impressed by that. They don't care, because the music and what the Beatles did is so much a part of our daily life and so much a part of our music that it's already become the past. And there's something about being a part of your time, and the Beatles were revolutionary. They did create a revolution in music and in fashion and in culture and in politics. And I think younger people today cannot appreciate that because it's of a different time, and the Beatles have become something very ordinary in the sense that they have become absorbed by the culture. And it's the same thing with Dark Knight and The Watchmen and Mouse. The kind of storytelling that Frank Miller did on Daredevil and in Dark Knight has become very normal. And at the time, it was exceptional. It was different. But now, everybody imitates that. Even Scott Snyder imitates, Frank Miller's writing. And so it's difficult, I think, to appreciate what those books did at that time and what the Beatles did at that time. It's different looking back on it than it is living through it. Very different. Come on, Lutz.
You worked with Frank Miller before Dark Knight on Daredevil, and I made 2 interviews with Frank, and he once told me, well, I know that even if Daredevil was very, very successful, if the editor-in-chief came and the brother-in-law of the editor-in-chief wanted my job, he'll get it tomorrow. Was that right? Was that the situation you were working on at the beginning of the 80s?
We had an editor at the time whose name was Jim Shooter.
Jim Shooter.
Yeah.
Famous editor.
Is that what Frank is talking about?
He didn't mention the name.
Oh.
No, you didn't mention the name. let's not talk about the editor-in-chief, let's talk about the editors.
Listen, I never had any problem with Jim Shooter. Everybody else seemed to have a lot of problems with Jim. I usually get along with everybody. I don't know how I do it, but I never had any problems. I remember one time, if those of you who are Daredevil fans, you may know that we did. Frank wrote a story about the Punisher and Daredevil and drugs, and we did that story. We handed it in, and Jim said, "No, we can't do this story because it's about drugs." And I remember being in the office, and Frank and I were in Jim Shooter's office, and Frank and I were looking at each other, thinking, "What the hell are we going to do now?" I don't know. We really didn't know what to do. And so we took the story that we did, and we put it aside, and we came up with a new book, a new issue of Daredevil in 3 weeks, from writing, penciling, inking, coloring. We did the whole book in 3 weeks, and it wasn't a very good Daredevil issue, but we didn't want to do a reprint because that was our choice. That was the choice that was given us. Jim said, "You can't run this story, and we're going to have to go for a reprint." And we didn't want to do that to the fans, which is, I have to say, very nice of us. And Frank especially. I think that was, and that story eventually came out, that drug issue of Daredevil. We made a few changes in it. We redid a few panels, added a page or two. But that was really the only time that I can remember that Jim interfered. The Daredevil was a book that was going to be canceled, and maybe you know this story.
Yeah.
Story. It was bi-monthly, which means that it came out once every 2 months, and it was doing very badly. So
sometimes it had only reprints in it.
Yes, and frankly, I'll tell you that this is the same thing that happened to the X-Men when Neil Adams and Roy Thomas came on board. The book was about to be canceled, and Neil said I guess Roy was the editor at the time, said, "Give me your lowest selling book." And so they said, "Sure, go ahead, take the X-Men," which was the lowest selling book that Marvel was publishing. And so when you're on a book that sells really badly, the editors don't really look at it with as much attention as, say, a higher selling book like Spider-Man or something. So we were able to do anything we wanted because nobody cared. And so the book got better sales and went monthly, and it was, quite successful. But
it even beat the X-Men as far as
Did
I
it?
know. As far as I know,
I-
it did better.
I'd like to think so. But so the secret was, that we were on a book that nobody really paid a lot of attention to. So we were able to do what we wanted to do, and they let me color it, which was I think a little unusual, for the same reason. Nobody really cared. So it was a time that we had a lot of freedom, and that time is gone.
And you became stars.
Oh, yeah.
Like rock stars, or no? I was always wondering when I read the letter pages of Daredevil. The book was highly successful, but I always thought the fans, they hate those guys. There are a lot of bad letters, and really a lot of hate about. You still remember the scene where Daredevil pulled that guy through the windshield. So, were you aware of this situation that you made a bestseller and a lot of readers hated you?
And they continue to hate me. Look, should I lie to you or should I be honest? What do you want to hear?
Lie. because it's more fun.
If anybody tells you that they don't read the letters, or these days, if they tell you they don't read the internet, they're lying. We all read it. We all hate you. Let me say, for myself personally, Superman is coming out next week, and this last week, I was already reading the reviews. I want the book to succeed. I want people to like the work, and what I object to. This is a larger conversation, and if we have time, we can go into it. But what I object to is the general ignorance of the people who are writing about the work, because, and I understand why. I understand why I think that also. I've spent 50 years doing this, and so in 50 years, I've learned about storytelling, and I've learned about comics, and I've learned about drawing, I've learned about writing. And a lot of the comments that are made on the internet are not made by people who have spent 50 years learning about this craft. And so there is a lot of ignorance, and I'll give you an example. Most people, when they review a book or a story, they talk about, let's say they talk about the art, mostly they talk about the writing and the story, and they tell you what happens in the story. And that's legitimate, Superman discovers kryptonite and Lois Lane dies. That's the story, whatever. And so they talk about that. They love that, or they didn't like that. And then when they talk about the art, they talk about what the art looks like. They talk about whether or not John Romita Jr. is drawing blocky figures, or whether his faces are pretty or not. What they don't talk about is what the art does. So there's a difference. And it's taken me 50 years to understand that comic books is not just about what the art looks like. It's about what the art does. Does the art tell the story? Does the art have clarity? Or is it confusing? Can you tell what's happening in the story without the words? Is the art functioning well? And I understand that somebody who's younger doesn't understand that. But I get frustrated that oftentimes the assessment or the evaluation of the art is entirely dependent on how the artist does hair, or muscles, or clothing, and not about does this artist understand how to tell a story with the art? So I hope you can see perhaps the beginning of the difference between what art looks like and what art does. And I'm more interested in what art does. So if you're asking me, do I get frustrated sometimes? Yes, the answer is yes. Do I take it personally? Yes, I do. yes, I do. And does it wound me? Yes, it does.
Leads me to my next question. One of my favorite piece of works of yours is a short story you did for Dark Horse with Andrew Vex. I was involved in the German edition of those stories, and I was fighting for this story to be published in this sampler, and I was that was so amazing piece of art, and I was wondering why don't you work more often alone? Why are you always working with other people like Frank Miller, John Romita?
First of all, and you know this, Frank Miller and John Romita are very talented people.
Sure.
And if you have an opportunity to work with talented people, it's tough for me to turn that down. It's these Frank and John and Gil Kane, John Buscema. These are enormously talented people, and if I'm lucky enough to ink them or work with them in any way, I think I would be foolish to turn that down. But what Lutz is talking about is I have a very strong passion for short stories. I think I often do my best work in 10 pages, 15 pages, 12 pages. I've done a couple of short stories, and they are among my best work that I've penciled and inked. I like short stories. I like writing short stories. I like drawing short stories. It's the long projects that I run out of steam. Page 30, I start to get bored, or start to get tired. But it's difficult to. Let me say this. Last year was a really good year for me because I had on my desk Daredevil End of Days. I was penciling that, and Bill Sienkiewicz was inking that. And then I was doing a Spider-Man that I was penciling and inking. And then I was inking some John Romita Captain America. So I had all at the same time. A penciling job, a inking job, and a penciling and inking job. And I think that that's a good way for me to work because it gives me variety. And I can pencil in the morning, I can ink at night. It's a good way to work for me. I found that to be just really effective.
How do you work with so different artists like Frank Miller and John Romita? How do you see your job inking them? You were talking about John Buscema, who made very, very loose pencils, and I always thought, well, John Buscema, he's very good if he had a good inker. But so how do you decide to work on the pencils of so different artists?
Well, this goes into, and I would ask all of you here, does anybody know what an inker does?
drawing the lines I heard from this Kevin Smith movie.
Does anybody have an answer to that question? Does anybody know what an inker does? It's the one part of comics that no one knows what an inker does, including, by the way, the editors. I have no idea what an inker does, you know. Go ahead, sir.
The inker was called the embellisher in old times.
Yes, sometimes on a good day, yes, an embellisher. But you know, an inker is an animal of mystery. Inkers have to be, I think, very adaptable, flexible, and you have to pay attention to the penciler. I cannot ink John Buscema the same way that I ink Frank Miller. It won't work. I can't ink John Romita Jr. the same way that I would ink Gene Colan. It does not work. You have to be adaptable. And I think one of the best characteristics of a good artist, whether it's a penciler or an inker or a writer, is your ability to be flexible, your ability to be adaptable, your ability to have more than one style to offer. And I would like to think that, you know, I can do that. So when I sit down now, if I ink John Buscema, I have to think differently than inking John Romita. And an inker, you know, one of the things an inker does, or is supposed to do, is see the mistakes, if I could say mistakes, maybe that's a too strong a word, the weakness, that's a better word, is to see the weakness in the pencils, because every penciler has a weakness, or two or three. It could be anatomy, it could be backgrounds, it could be spotting blacks, it could be composition. You know, not every penciler is good at every requirement. So a good inker is supposed to be able to see where the penciler needs help. And I can't ink John Buscema the same way, because John Buscema is not the same artist as John Romita Jr. They're different. And they have different strengths, and they have different weaknesses. So you have to be able to see where they need a little bit of a push. And then you have to decide, are you going to ink them with a heavy line, with a light line? Do they need depth? You know, do they need foreground, middle ground, background? You know, not to get too technical, but comics has no depth. It's flat. It's a piece of paper. So a penciler and an inker, one of your first jobs has to be to create the illusion. You know what that means? The illusion of depth. You're creating something that doesn't really exist because paper is flat. So you're creating something that is a trick. It's like magic. And some artists are not good at depth. So inker tries to, you know, even with the line, even with, you know, drawing a shoulder, you can create depth by drawing a shoulder or inking a shoulder a certain way. So it involves a lot of study and learning and practice. It's not something that comes easy. Let me say this. I teach a class in New York in the fall and in the spring, college kids, 19, 20, 21, 24, 25. And I had this one student last year, which was just over. And in the third class, he raised his hand, and he looked exactly like Charlie Brown. I've never seen anybody look like Charlie Brown in real life. He had this big round head like a pumpkin, and you know, his eyes were
Sounds like my editor.
It was just, it was amazing. I'm so proud of the fact that in the 6 months that I had him in my class, I never once said that to him. So he raised his hand in the 3rd class, and I remember this because he was a pain in the ass. And he raised his hand, and I said, you know, what? And he said, "This is hard." And I said, "Yes, that's right. That's your first lesson. This is hard. This is difficult. This is something that requires a lot of work and ambition and perseverance. This is not something that you can do for a hobby. If you want to do this, this is hard and it's going to take a lot of work." He didn't make it. Any questions from the audience?
In 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes.
Do you have a favorite artist, a favorite penciler to work with?
To work with, you know, everybody has qualities that I very much admire. I like John Romita because of his ability to be dynamic. You know, he's a little bit like Kirby, although there is no one like Kirby. But John comes, you know, he combines some of Kirby in his work, especially on the Thor. We did Thor for a couple of issues, and I thought it was terrific. John told me that he had all the Xeroxes of Jack Kirby's work hanging on his wall while he was doing Thor, which I thought was a very, very good idea. So I like John's, you know, he's very dynamic penciler. Frank Miller is a very interesting penciler. He's not really a good drawer. He doesn't draw pretty faces or pretty people, but he's very interesting in terms of body language and also storytelling, panel to panel relationships. He's quite good at that. And part of the reason why he is quite good at that is because he writes and draws the stories that he's doing. Sometimes when you get a script from a writer, a penciler may not be in sync, so to speak, you know, with each other. But if you're writing and drawing, it reaches a higher level, I think, of art. John Buscema is, you know, very fluid. I think that he's very graceful. Gil Kane is one of my favorite pencilers of all time. I think Gil Kane is my favorite American penciler. I like Alfonso Font, who is I think Spanish, or Argentinian. I think Argentinian artist. He's one of my favorites. I was in France 2 weeks ago, and I discovered a guy called Corrado Mastantuono. He did a text, TEX, and he is amazing. He just impressed me, really just impressed me. Incredible. His work was amazing. So I like a variety of people, and I like a variety of styles. Gene Colan was a real pleasure to ink, although I always thought I did a bad job on Gene Colan. He's very tough, very difficult to ink, very difficult. Tom Palmer was the best Gene Colan inker, I think. That was a great combination.
Did you ink his last edible work?
Who, Gene?
Yeah.
No.
Because it looks very, very modern. It was very.
Is that right?
Well done.
Thank you.
You are in the business for 40 years now. Can you talk about how the business changes in this time? I mean, at the beginning we talked about the year of '86 and being in the middle of this revolution, and now we are in 2014 and in my opinion, the superhero publishers are getting more and more protective for their characters. So, as an artist, you get less and less freedom That's my point of view, or maybe I'm wrong. So.
No, I think that what my friend is saying is true. I think, if here's the bad news. The bad news is that nothing revolutionary is going to come out of Marvel or DC. It's done. It's over. However, the good news is that the independent market, image and self-publishing and the internet and the variety of material that is out there has never been better than it is right now. Never. Even the golden period that people talk about in the 40s, the 50s, with EC Comics or Captain Marvel and all of that stuff, it's never been better than it is right now. This is the best time for comics ever. And the variety of genres and material, westerns and romance, fantasy and crime and superheroes and everything you can think of, horror, is being published right now, today. And it's being done very, very well. So if you want superheroes, you go to Marvel, you go to DC, and that's what you're going to get, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But nothing revolutionary is going to come out of Marvel or DC because they are very protective of their properties. They don't want people fooling around with them too much. A little bit on the sides. They're interested in protecting their properties for the movies. Obviously, you all know that. But comics has never been healthier than it is right now. I'm extremely happy to see that. When I got into the business, it was maybe 74, 75. I'm almost dead, by the way. But 74, 75, everybody said we have 5 more years of publishing. And then we got to 1980. And in 1980, they said, oh, we have 5 more years. And we got to 1985, and they said, oh, we have 5 more years. It was always 5 more years and comics would be gone. And everybody believed that. I never believed it for a minute. But everybody did believe that, and everybody was working with that kind of pressure. But right now, comics are the best that they have ever been. And I'm enjoying it, very much so. Every week I go get the new comics. I go, I live in New York. There's a Forbidden Planet a couple of blocks from my house. And I'm there every Wednesday. I pick up the new comics. I think it's amazing.
What do you read?
I read everything. Well, let me say this. I look at everything, and I read some things. I'm really impressed with Starlight by Mark Miller and Goran Pavlov, I think is his name. I really like that book. I thought that was very well done. Simple, to the point, not very complicated, interesting premise. I like that right now. That's one of my favorite books. I generally like anything that Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips do. So Fatale, I'm liking that. I'm looking forward to their new project. Stuff that's interesting. Or artists that I like, I follow, writers. I was very impressed with the new Batman that Scott Snyder wrote, that Greg Capullo did. And I think Greg Capullo is doing great work on Batman. It's terrific. He's really, really good. But the script in the last, I think it was number 32, that was pretty amazing. I thought that was really good work.
So, ich würde es jetzt gerne öffnen. Also wenn Fragen aus dem Publikum sind, würde ich mich doch sehr... Ja, da hinten ist schon jemand.
Auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch? Ich auf Englisch.
What was that?
Okay.
Versuchen wir es erstmal auf Englisch.
Okay, Mr. Janson, I have a question. What do you think about Frank Miller's movies? The Spirit, for example, with Gabriel Macht and Sin City?
I have to be honest with you, I did not see them. I really didn't. I did read SimCity, and I liked some of it. I did not like all of it. I think my favorite one was called Family Values. I think that was my favorite one, with the girl with the roller skates. But I didn't see the movie. I have. Let me say this. As I've gotten older, I have changed my mind about violence. And when I was younger, I believed that violence didn't make any difference. And as I got older, I have come to the point where I object to it. I'm not interested in violence in media or gore or blood and guts. I think that there are more interesting ways to tell a story, and I know, that Sin City, there are some things in there that I'm a little uncomfortable with. So I'm not really interested in that, So I deliberately didn't see the movies. What do you think of them?
I think that Sin City is very dark and very violent, but it inspired me to draw comics and to write comics.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's a
good beginning.
That's the best result I could hope for.
But that's what we were talking about at the beginning. I think Daredevil was very violent too.
Well, there's it depends how you define violence. If violence is used because it's a valid story, that's one thing. I'll give you an example. I inked a Punisher a couple of years ago. That was the beginning of Frankencastle, I think. But anyways, he was on a rooftop with Wolverine's son, Daken, and Daken cut the Punisher up in pieces. Cut his arms off, cut his head off, cut his legs off, and then pushed the body parts down into the alley. And as an inker, I didn't read the script. I don't generally read the script if I'm an inker. And I didn't know that was coming. And so, you ink 15 pages and all of a sudden there's a fight scene and Punisher gets cut up into pieces and shoved the body parts down into the alley. I was uncomfortable with that. I didn't think that was necessary. And I thought that it was a bad idea. I just thought it was not necessary. And let me say this, I do not believe in censorship. I don't believe that the government, whether it's federal or state or local, should tell us what to do or what to read. I don't believe that. But I believe we are responsible. And I believe that we have individual responsibility about what we put out there. And I know that people are reading the Bible or the Quran and creating violence because of what they read. And I know that, those people are crazy. So it doesn't matter in a way what you read. If you're crazy, you're crazy. You could read a grocery list and say, okay, I'm gonna, shoot people. But I do believe that we have a responsibility for quality and for things that are a benefit to society and not a detriment. I hope that's clear.
Yes.
Yep.
Over there.
Yeah. When I was showing my pencil drawings to other artists in the US and even to editors, I got the feedback that they look nice as drawings and the storytelling is good, but they are not readable for an inker. So I have to be aware that not every inker can read it and they might mess up the whole page or what I intended to do. So my question would be, what would you say, what must a penciler provide for an inker that an inker can work on pencils?
I think that, my guess is that your pencils were probably not tight enough. That would be my guess of what, the editors are saying to you. But we live, comics today are, most inkers are tracers. And most pencilers want a tracer. So, and by tracer I mean, somebody that's very faithful to the pencils. And I understand that, I get that. So I think that you probably need to be more specific about your line and perhaps even the weight of your line. How thin or how thick it is. We have raised a generation of pencilers who don't know how to tell a story. And we have raised a generation of inkers who don't know how to do anything but trace. So it is what it is. This is just a situation. But I would guess, does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, it does. It does. I was just surprised in a way, not about my art, that was perfectly fine, but I was surprised in a way that I got feedback, especially from other pencilers, artists, say be careful, because otherwise your whole page would be like not what you would want it to be. So, and that was kind of surprising for me to recognize from other artists to say, okay, that's what an inker does, or maybe the inkers, well, actually they said that a lot of inkers can draw themselves, that's why they're inking.
That's right.
And
That's right.
So be careful with what you do.
Yeah, and that last comment is correct, that I wouldn't say inkers can't draw and that's why they become inkers, but I would say the best inkers know how to draw. Tom Palmer, Dick Giordano, Wally Wood, Joe Sinnott. Joe Sinnott, I think, is probably the best inker that ever lived. And he knows how to draw. You have to understand what the drawing is in order to ink it correctly. And there aren't a lot of inkers like that anymore. Wally Wood is gone, Joe Sinnott is retired, Tom Palmer is working, Dick Giordano is gone. There aren't a lot of inkers that can draw. So my advice to you would be just, I think, without seeing your pencils, that you probably need to tighten them up, and maybe your pencils are a little scratchy,
Yeah, could be. So,
Or, there's another way of approaching this. You could ink it yourself.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
That's not a bad idea. Yeah.
Reminds me on the first time I saw a page done by Michael Turner. This guy who died very young. And I was wondering, because I was looking at this page and thinking, what is that? I didn't see one thing. So the work on his pages was done by the inkers and the colorists. They made it readable. They made it look well.
Let me say, there were times when I got pencils by John Buscema or by Bill Kane. They didn't put any blacks in, and it was all just lines with no weight, and it was what the editors wanted. Because if they penciled without blacks or without weight, or they were doing breakdowns, is what they used to call. So you can do 3 books of breakdowns instead of 1 book of pencils. So, it's a meat market, it's an assembly line. So they want to, everybody wants 3 books from one guy instead of 1 book. And so to ink that was a real challenge and a learning experience, which I very, very much enjoyed. But, today, you don't do that. The style is very tight pencils, very, very tight. If you're not inking your own pencils, they should be tight enough so that you could shoot them and scan them and color them without inks. That's how tight pencils generally are today.
We have 2 more questions, one from the lady back.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your speech today, and I would like to
Thanks.
know how much do you work by hand and how much you work digitally, and how do you do it with your students, if you start by hand and then digitally, or you do everything digitally?
I don't do anything digitally, and I did. Maybe this will amuse you. I did hire. I am hiring. I did hire a tutor to teach me how to use the Cintiq. I have a Cintiq in my studio that I hang my clothes on, and I'm learning how to use the Cintiq and do some digital stuff. But with my students, I find it very interesting that there is a great deal of passion for non-digital work, for paper and pencils and ink. And some of the best students that I had that are working in comics are doing paper, not digital. Funny story, or maybe not funny. I did Daredevil End of Days with Bill Sienkiewicz. Bill Sienkiewicz inked my pencils on that. And I was just so happy, doing that project, doing that script. That was a great script. And working with Bill, I'm just, in love with Bill's work. So we get the original pages back, and I'm looking at the pages. He never finishes the pages on the paper. He will do outlines of figures, and then he'll leave the blacks empty, and he'll scan the pages in and ink them in digitally. So when I get the pages back, I get them at home and I start filling in the blacks. It's so funny. I hate that guy. But it's Bill, so Bill is a genius. But I'm not. Years ago, people told me that inkers would disappear. They haven't disappeared. And now people are saying that, paper is going to disappear. It's not going to disappear. So it will, digital and paper and, will work side by side.
Okay, last question from the guy in green.
There are a lot of discussion between penciler and media, like penciler after your job is done tells you, well, you didn't ink it right, or next time you have to ink it otherwise. I mean, it's your work that gets printed, not the penciler's work, and so some penciler might get upset.
So what is your question?
The discussion, is there a lot of fighting or discussion between inker and penciler?
Let me say. I think that there is some tension between any penciler and any inker, and there are often times when a penciler may not be happy with the inking, and I remember I'll mention 3 guys. Joe Quesada, Adam Kubert, and Jim Lee. I inked each one of them, and none of them asked me to ink them again. It's just the way it is. So there is tension, and I like tension, you know, between the penciler and the inker, and between the penciler and a writer. There should be, you know, a little bit of disagreement, and there should be a little bit of friction. I think that the best work that Frank Miller and I did was a combination of the two of us, where neither Frank nor I was the top guy. We created a third person, and that to me is a very satisfying and successful collaboration.
Gut, vielen Dank. Schneller Schluss, schneller Anfang. Ich bitte nochmal um Entschuldigung für den unprofessionellen Auftritt. Vielen Dank. Thank you very much.
Thank you.